Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Order. I'm sorry, but we must now move on. Urgent question, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Education to make a statement on the appointment of Toby Young to the Board of Office for Students.
The Minister of State, Mr. Joe Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Office for Students came into being on the 1st of January and will be operational from April. It will put quality of teaching, student choice and value for money at the heart of what it does. It will be helped in this by a remarkably broad and strong board, bringing together a wide range of talents and backgrounds, including vice-chancellors, graduate employers, legal and regulatory experts, as well as a student representative mandated by statute. The board also brings a diversity of views. Its excellent chair, Sir Michael Barber, was a senior advisor to a former Labour Prime Minister. Several of its members have declared themselves to be past or present members of the party opposite. This is clearly not a body of Conservative stooges, but one that draws on talent wherever it can be found. The opposition have called today's debate to discuss one of the board's 15 members, Toby Young. They would have us believe that he's not qualified or suitable to be on the board. Yes, Mr. Young is not a university insider, but a board made up of only university insiders would be hard-pressed to provide the scrutiny and challenge to the sector that students and taxpayers deserve. Indeed, the Higher Education and Research Act requires the Secretary of State to have regard to the desirability of the Office for Students board members between them, having far wider experience, including that of promoting choice for consumers and of encouraging competition. Mr. Young has real experience of both of those things as the founder of the West London Free School and now as the director of the New Schools Network, helping parents around the country to set up schools of their own. This experience will be important for the new regulator, a regulator that will be charged with creating a level playing field for high-quality new providers to offer degrees alongside established universities. At the school Mr. Young set up, the West London Free School, 38.5% of children receive the pupil premium, and they have done better than the national average for those on the pupil premium this year and last. And a parent governor at the school this week described him as committed to public education, academic excellence, and greater opportunities for kids from lower incomes. And he has also won praise for supporting diversity there in making the school a safe and supportive place for LGBT+ students. He is also an eloquent advocate of free speech, a value intrinsic to successful universities, which the OFS has undertaken to uphold. He has served with credit on the board of the US-UK Fulbright Commission, where he has been a strong supporter of the Commission's work with the Sutton Trust to help disadvantaged young people attend US universities. Indeed, the chair of the Fulbright Commission, Sir Nigel Scheinwald, has described him as an effective, committed and energetic commissioner and said that he had seen no evidence that any remarks of Mr. Young's had influenced him in dispatching his duties as a commissioner. The honourable member has called today's debate to discuss tweets and remarks, some of them going back to the 1980s. These were foolish and wrong and do not reflect the values of the government. I'm not aware that anything he has said in the past has been found to have breached our strong discrimination laws, which are among the toughest in the world. And in future, of course, Toby Young will be bound to comply with the Equality Act of 2010 in performing all of his functions for the Office for Students. But regardless of the legal position, it is, of course, right that Mr. Young has apologised unreservedly to the OFS board. It is also right that he has said he regrets the comments and has given an undertaking that the kind of remarks made in the past will not be repeated. So be in no doubt, if he or any board member were to make these kind of inappropriate comments in the future, they would be dismissed. But as the Prime Minister said yesterday, Mr. Young, since these comments and tweets, has been doing exceedingly good work in our education system. And it is for that reason that he is well placed to make a valuable contribution to the work of the board of the Office for Students, where he will continue to do much more to support the disadvantaged than so many of his armchair critics.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not lost on me that I'm up against one of the Johnson brothers and I'm asking questions about one of their mates. Sexist and homophobic language must have no place in our society, and parliamentarians of all parties have a duty to stamp out this sort of behaviour whenever we encounter it and condemn it in its strongest possible terms. Those are the words of the Secretary of State for Women and Equalities and Education. So, and it's a shame that she's not here today, Mr. Speaker. I'm not quite sure what job she has at the moment. But, Mr. Speaker, I know that the Leader of the House is with us today, and we sit, and she chairs an excellent committee where we talk about eradicating sexual harassment, victimisation and bullying in this House and changing the culture of that in this House. So I am flabbergasted, and it's beyond me how the Minister can stand up and support this appointment. I find it very hard to comprehend the appointment of Toby Young, and I think that it leaves the OFS credibility in tatters. And there are 3 areas that need to be urgently addressed today. Number 1 is the process. What was the process that was followed? Was the Nolan principle as outlined in the application applied? Was due process followed in all cases? Who was the independent assessor? Because I cannot find that person's name. Why did the DFE exaggerate Toby Young's qualifications and suitability for the role? And has the Commissioner for Public Appointments approved this appointment? The second is suitability. Has the Department for Education guidelines for the 7 principles of public life been upheld? Most people would laugh at that, but I'll leave the Minister to respond. Toby Young's long history of misogynistic and homophobia makes a mockery of such guidelines. A man who writes about how he goes to a gay club dressed as a woman to molest lesbians is far from appropriate. Far from apologising, he has defended his actions as free speech. And it may be free speech, but it surely shows that he is not suitable to hold public office. And just 13 months ago, 13 months ago, somebody put a sexual harassment document on his desk, and he writes, Toby Young writes himself, he says, somebody left this sexual harassment policy on his desk. He goes on to say, the next bit was underlined in red felt tip pen. A joke considered amusing by one may be offensive to another. I found out just how true these words were when I hired a strippogram to surprise a male colleague on his birthday on what turned out to be Take Our Daughters to Work Day. I challenge the Minister to explain. And the third is merit. The Prime Minister said on the steps of number 10 that people will be promoted on merit, not on privilege. Is this still a case? Or is having a friend like the Johnsons overrides all of that? There are over 800 free schools, which means that there are a plethora of suitable people with the criteria who could have been involved in the Office for Students. Is it just simply a case of the jobs for boys? Boris Johnson, the Minister's brothers, declared that he has caustic wit, which makes him the ideal man for the job. If boasting of masturbating over pictures of dying and starving children caustic wit, then I have most definitely lost my sense of humour. Why was the Prime Minister not aware of the comments before this appointment was made? Simple. It's not too late. And if there is, in fact, an apology rather than a statement of regret, I wonder if the Minister will place it along with the 40,000 deleted tweets in the library.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On several of the member opposite's points, on the point of process, yes, Mr. Young's appointment to the Office for Students Board was made in line with the Office of the Commissioner for Public Appointments Code of Practice. Mr. Young was appointed through a fair and open competition. He was selected for interview based on the advertised criteria, interviewed by the same panel that interviewed all the other board candidates. Michael Barber, Sir Michael Barber, who's the chair of the Office for Students, was one of the panel members, a senior civil servant was the other, and an independent panel member from the HE sector was the third, and that panel found Mr. Young to be appointable. On the second point, Mr. Speaker, whether the Department for Education exaggerated Mr. Young's qualifications, absolutely, categorically not. Mr. Young was a teaching fellow at Harvard and a teaching assistant at Cambridge, positions for which he received payment. The Department for Education never claimed that these were academic posts. Mr. Young, as I've said, is a Fulbright Commissioner. He's co-founded the West London Free School, and this experience will be vital in encouraging new providers and ensuring more universities are working effectively with schools.
Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that I'm in support of the work that he's doing and of universities, but on this one, I think things have gone badly wrong. I accept that Mr. Young has done great work on free schools, but so have many other people. And I'm not talking about the things that he's done on Twitter. What I'm more concerned about is some quite dark articles where he talks about the disabled, where he talks about working classes, and much more significantly in 2015, and I have the article here, on what he calls progressive eugenics. Now, I find this incredibly dark and very dangerous stuff, and I suggest to my honourable friend that he looks again at this appointment, because I do not think it will put confidence in students.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I always listen very closely to what my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee has to say, and of course I will look carefully at the article he has with him. But what I would say is that Mr. Young has expressed his regrets. He's apologised unreservedly for comments that have been made, in some cases going back to the 1980s. These are often very old writings, old pieces of work, and I think actually it's more helpful to members if we focus on what he does rather than what he says. He has been a champion, Mr. Speaker, of students, of children with disabilities in mainstream education. He himself, Mr. Young, has a brother. He has a brother with learning disabilities, and he is patron. Mr. Young does what he should, and Mr. Young is patron of the residential care home in which his brother, who has learning disabilities, lives. So we shouldn't characterise him in the crude terms that members opposite do. His deeds matter much more than the terms and the tweets he has disowned.
Order. Using language slightly loosely, the Minister referred at the outset to how the Shadow Minister had called this debate. On advice, I just gently remind the House that this is not supposed to be a debate, or therefore the occasion for speeches, either from the backbench or the front, but for pithy questions and answers, to which I know we will now, with enthusiasm, return. Lucy? Sorry? Yes, indeed. Mr. Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Happy New Year. Mr. Speaker, this appointment sums up this incompetent government. It's a Tory crony who the Department of Education did exaggerate his qualifications. Now, Toby Young thinks teachers have it easy. He's shown prejudice against the working class, made several misogynistic tweets, and, as we heard, joked about massive rent to comic relief images of children in Africa. Now, when this comes to light, what's the Tory MP's reaction, including the Foreign Secretary, to defend Toby Young? Now, Young himself doesn't seem to care. He hasn't made a true apology, and he says most tweets are several years old. That seems to be the Minister's attitude for the dispatch box, which frankly is putting his head in the sand. It was only 2 years ago that Toby Young was writing about eugenics for the working class. Now, this comes in the back of this House, supposed to be trying to be seen to clean up its heart. Honourable members in the benches opposite were only too keen to call for action against the Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam when his inappropriate tweets were made public. So their anti-hypocrisy is absolutely stinking. It's been suggested that Toby Young's in a yellow card. I'd like to ask the Minister, what constitutes a red card?
Hear, hear.
Will this appointment process be reviewed, and what's actually going to be done by this government to allay the concerns of the National Education Union, students, the wider general public, and when will they lead by example?
Hear, hear, hear.
I would refer the honourable member to the Prime Minister's remarks yesterday on the Marsh Show, where she was absolutely explicit that she expects no repetition of any of the remarks or comments or utterances that have been the subject of considerable attention over the last week. Any member of the board of the Office for Students who said such things would no longer carry on in that position, and that will be the position going forward.
Maria Miller.
Speaker, the Minister here is dealing with an independent appointments process, and I would just like to know from him what account the public appointments process takes of the public views of candidates, particularly when they might be so clearly at odds with the equality principles that this government is clearly supportive of.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Member, my friend, for her question. Of course, the Office for Students is there to represent all of the interests in our higher education system. The Higher Education and Research Act puts an obligation on the Secretary of State to have regard to a wide range of factors in making these appointments. These include that the board members must be reflective of a broad range of providers of higher education, and also of those who experience higher education, the students, and also those such as taxpayers and businesses who either pay for it or are on the receiving end of the products from it in the form of a flow of graduates into the workforce. So, of course, government is attentive to reactions to appointments to the board. We want it to be a board that's highly effective at delivering on the Office for Students' core duties.
Rafsal Khan.
Speaker. Toby labelled Islam a deeply misogynist religion and referred to the choice of some Muslim women to adopt the hijab as a forced by male oppression. At a time when many more young British Muslim women are entering higher education, does the government consider it appropriate to appoint such a person to the Office for Students? And what likelihood is there that Toby Young will command the respect of those Muslim women in higher education who wear the hijab?
The Minister replies, I say to the Honourable Lady, who was looking almost inconsolable not to be called, it is true that I was looking in her direction at an earlier stage. I might very well do so again, but it would be a pity to squander her at too early a stage of our proceedings. I'm saving her up. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in response to that question and to many others which might relate to individual tweets or articles or comments that Mr. Young's made over a long period of time, the answer is basically the same, which is that he has acknowledged, government has recognised that much of what he has said was foolish or wrong, offensive, obnoxious. And it's right that he's apologised, and it's right that he's expressed regret for what he's said or written or done. It clearly does not reflect the values of the Office for Students or of the government. But it's also important to recognise that since he's made many of those remarks, he's continued to make a valuable contribution to our educational system, to the work of the Fulbright Commission, to the network of free schools across the country, and it's for that reason that he's been appointed to the board of the Office for Students.
I welcome the Honourable Member for Morley and Outwood on her return from maternity leave. And it was a pleasure to attend her wedding. Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's good to have you at the wedding. Mr. Speaker, members opposite, they do... I maybe need to rephrase that. But, Mr. Speaker, members opposite, they feign outrage at Mr. Young's use of social media. Now, maybe you should look at the way, maybe members should look at the way your own Labour activists and Momentum treat other candidates as they did during the general election. I myself got attacked by somebody called Corbyn Chick for being an unmarried mother. And so where's the family values? So maybe you should look... Well, maybe if you listened rather than shouted, yeah. So maybe you should look at the way your own Momentum activists and Labour Party activists actually treat other candidates on social media. So why the hypocrisy?
Minister!
Well, I think my honourable friend makes an important point, Mr. Speaker, about double standards, because when it comes to the misogyny and misogynistic attitudes that are frankly rampant on the Labour benches, as has been acknowledged by the member for Birmingham Yardley, who described a persistent pattern of low-level, non-violent misogyny at the top of the Labour Party, it is important that members opposite... That's what the member for Birmingham Yardley said. It is important that honourable members don't apply double standards when addressing this question.
Order, I just say to the honourable gentleman, the Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, sir, if you were a motor car, you would go from 0 to 60 in about 5 seconds. It is a discernible trait that I have discerned in you over a period of years, and I wish to help you with this condition. Calm yourself, just a little calmer. You've many, many hours to go, many important developments to take place. Now, after due patience exercised, Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think Mr. Young's comments over the last few months and years speak for themselves, and they reflect a gross misjudgment from this government in now trying to defend those comments. But let's just take a moment to look at his record, as the Minister is so keen to talk to us about. If you have a look at the data dashboard for the West London Free School, you will, the Minister would find that the progress rate at that school is in fact average. The percentage of children on pupil premium is in fact below that for Hammersmith and Fulham, and well below that for inner London. And maybe that's why the school has only just got a good by Ofsted. I could give the Minister many, many more people with much more experience. So isn't this a case of chumocracy, as the member for Harlow rightly said?
Mr. Johnson.
Armchair critics who don't do half as much good as Mr. Young does for disadvantaged students in London and across the country. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite has questioned the record of the West London Free School. Well, its GCSE results for 2016 put it in the top 10% of all English schools in the country.
Dr. Sarah Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm afraid I feel that Mr. Young's comments do cross a line, and they're indicative of an underlying character and the kind of person that would tweet comments to a woman that talk about masturbating over images of refugees. I'm afraid it just does cross a line, and I do feel that he should withdraw, or at least, as we all do when we apply for jobs, we say whether or not there is anything in our past that could cause embarrassment. If that question was asked and it was answered no, well, clearly there is a case for the board revisiting and asking him to step down.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I recognise, as I've already said, that many of the tweets, and I haven't obviously seen all 40,000 of them, have been obnoxious and repellent in many ways. But it is also important to recognise that that tweet, I think, was probably 8 or 9 years old, since which time Mr. Young has been on something of a developmental journey. It is possible that there is a capacity for reform, and I think we want to encourage Mr. Young to develop the best sides of his personality, the sides that have led to him setting up good schools, to working with disadvantaged children in London so that they can make the most of their potential. And it's for those reasons that he's been appointed to the board.
Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a fault line in politics between people who want a modern democracy with people appointed on the basis of their merit rather than their mates. And I'm surprised that the Minister, who's meant to be a serious person, has found himself on the other side of that fault line. Can I ask the Minister specifically about Mr. Young's comments in the last 2 to 3 years, and they were raised by the chairman of the Select Committee, where Mr. Young has advocated what he called progressive eugenics. Not in 2009, in 2015. He repeated it in November 2017. It was removed by the Teach First website, and he claimed he'd been no-platformed and censored. Does this sound like someone who's remorseful? Does this sound like someone who is suitable for public office? Why on earth has he done this, not only to the credibility of himself and his Prime Minister, but of the Office for Students?
Minister.
Mr. Young's work on behalf of disadvantaged and disabled students speaks for itself. He has championed inclusion in the educational institutions that he's set up. I cannot speak for the content of specific articles or tweets because, frankly, there are too many of them, and he's apologized for any offense he's caused in them. But I think we should judge him by what he does more so than we are currently doing.
David T.C. Davis.
Mr. Speaker, could the Minister confirm that Toby Young has never used social media to tweet out bomb threats against rival politicians, unlike one member of the Labour Party who's named in the newspaper today, and that some of this outrage is little more than an extension of the no-platform policy being used to drive out anyone with a right of centre view from the university sector?
Minister.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point, and it's the same one made a few moments ago, essentially, which is that there are double standards being applied here. Members opposite should look at their own use of social media, the appalling slurs on Conservative candidates, frequently levelled ahead of the general election, the deception targeted at students with respect to Labour Party's intentions on student fees and tuition debt, for example. Look at their own record on the use of social media before criticising others.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister suggest, simply because Mr. Young, under pressure, has now apologised for his dark and dangerous comments, that he no longer holds these views that he has held over many years?
Minister.
Mr. Young has apologised, as the honourable member has said. He said he regrets the comments, which suggests that he has moved on. And he has also committed to not repeating comments and accepted the reality that if he does repeat comments of that sort, then he will no longer be publicly appointed to the Office for Students Board.
Ms. Bernard-Jenkin.
The Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee oversees the public appointments process, and we hold the Public Appointments Commissioner accountable for the conduct of the code. This is a timely reminder that public appointments are to be held accountable. Is my right honourable friend satisfied that the panel had the due diligence that they should have had when they made their appointment, and what representations has he received from any member of the panel about this appointment since the appointment was made?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his questions. The panel was correctly composed. As I said earlier, it consisted of a senior civil servant from DFE, Sir Michael Barber himself, and an independent panel member. They conducted the interview with Mr. Young in the same manner that they conducted the interview with other candidates, found him appointable. And in respect of due diligence, one has to look at what's reasonable and proportionate for a panel to do in terms of due diligence. Neither I nor the department were aware of these offensive tweets before his appointment was made, but there's nothing unusual about that. These remarks in many cases were made years, in some cases decades in the past, and it's not reasonable or proportionate for government to trawl through tens of thousands of tweets over many years when making public appointments.
Laura Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a woman and as the mother of a young girl, I am appalled that the Minister and the Prime Minister deems it suitable for an appointment to this position of a man like this. He has joked about anal rape against women. He talks about women's breasts constantly on Twitter. Will the Minister not join me and condemn this misogynistic view coming from somebody who is going to be in a position of power, and show all of those young girls who are looking at this government that this simply is not good enough?
Minister.
I agree with the sentiment the honourable member has expressed. These comments and tweets are obviously obnoxious and repellent, and that's why it's right that he's apologised for them. It's right that he's expressed regret for them. and it's right that he's committed not to repeating them at the risk of being immediately dismissed from the Office for Students Board.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been interested to hear the Minister's answers. Can he reassure me as to what evidence he took in relation to Mr. Young's current appointment as a Fulbright Commissioner, and what reassurances he's got to satisfy himself that some of the behaviour we've discussed this afternoon will not be repeated?
Minister.
Well, Toby Young, Mr. Young, does important work on the Fulbright Commission. He's a commissioner. He's been reappointed to that role as a result of the good work that he's been doing there, and that carries on. As I said earlier, Sir Nigel Scheinwald, the chair of the Fulbright Commissioner, has described him as an effective, committed and energetic commissioner, and seen no evidence that these past remarks, these historic remarks going back many years, have influenced him in discharging his duties responsibly on behalf of disadvantaged young people. And he does very, very good work in promoting social mobility through the Fulbright Commission's work with the Sutton Trust and other organisations.
Hello, Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister asks us to judge Mr. Young by what he does. As one of the many women who have had personal, repeated and recent experiences of his ability to lose friends and alienate people, I say to the Minister, an undergraduate student would know it is not evidence enough of a change in behaviour for someone simply, when they have been caught out, to say sorry. And every educationalist would say to the Minister that rewarding bad behaviour as he is sends a terrible message to our universities about the standards we accept. What more does Mr. Young have to say until the Minister realises he deserves to say on Twitter, not in teaching?
Mr. Speaker, since he made many of these comments and articles and so forth, which in most cases date to pre-2010, he has been appointed to the Fulbright Commission. He's been reappointed to the Fulbright Commission. He's been made director of a leading educational charity, and he's been doing important work setting up schools in West London that are delivering great outcomes for young people. This is what we should judge him by, not foolish and obnoxious tweets from the distant past.
My constituents in Kettering have no time for unpleasant and obscene remarks, no matter who makes them. Will the Minister ensure that all appointees to the board, including this one, have as one of their first priorities a close examination of the obscene and outrageous levels of executive pay for some of the senior personnel in the higher and further education sector, which many students regard as completely outrageous?
Minister. Well, my honourable friend makes a good point, and it's a priority for the Office for Students to address the issue of Vice-Chancellor pay, spiralling top-level pay in our institutions. It features in the regulatory framework consultation, which closed shortly before Christmas, and will be prominent in the regulatory framework when that's published later on in the spring.
Yvette Cooper.
The problem is that this man thought it was okay to publicly leer at women's bodies while they were in the workplace, including tweeting repeatedly about women, about their knockers, their breasts, their boobs, their backs, on and on. And what does it say to women across the country and young girls across the country that a government minister is defending them, including when he attacked a woman in this House, a woman MP in this House in that way? So why won't he instead stand with women across the world and across the globe who are saying to men like this, their time is up?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the government has condemned the tweets. Mr. Young has apologised for them. Any repetition of language of that kind will not be tolerated.
Simon Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suspect I'm one of the very few people in this chamber who has in fact been to the West London Free School, and I got to see it there for myself, the outstanding work that Toby and his team have delivered. And the way in which they deliver that, blind to background, blind to your wealth, blind to the colour of your skin, blind to the creed that you practice. And does the Minister not agree with me that that record deserves to be honoured, deserves to be recognised, that those comments were wrong, Those comments were wrong, but those deeds need to be respected, and that they give him a credible platform to take that office.
Mr. Well, my honourable friend is right to laud Mr. Young's achievements in the West London Free School. 38.5% of children there received the pupil premium, and they've done better than the national average for pupils on the pupil premium, both this year and last. And he's created also an inclusive environment there. A parent governor at the school has described him as committed to public education, academic excellence, and greater opportunities for kids from lower incomes.
Sangam Debonair.
No, I've been standing at all.
In a way, oh good.
Sorry.
No, because there are plenty of people who wish to take part. We're grateful. Dr. Rupa Huck.
Mr. Speaker, I'm usually first to congratulate my constituents on their achievements, but even Toby Young's Acton address cannot save him on this one. So how does his Spectator column on the 9th of December, not historic, but mere days before his appointment, when he boasted, "What a big swinging dick I am." The column was called The Subtle Art of Showing Off at Work. How does that, and the fact that his West London Free School has lost 5 head teachers in almost as many years, qualified Toby Young for this post?
Minister. Well, if members opposite had done half as much as Mr. Young has to promote the outcomes for disadvantaged students, they would be in a better position. They would be in a better position to disparage his achievements. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Young's school has done better than the national average for its pupils on the pupil premium, both this year and last, and that's something of which he can be rightly proud.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister is at pains to say that this appointment was non-compliant. It's standard practice in modern times for employers to look carefully at the social media profile of those whom they appoint, particularly to public office. I ask him again, what due diligence was carried out? Were those who appointed Mr. Young to this post aware of these obnoxious tweets? And if so, what was it about him that made him so uniquely qualified to this post over those without such an obnoxious social media profile?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, the competition through which Toby Young was appointed was rigorous, open and fair. His interviews, like all the interviews, was conducted by a panel consisting of the 3 members I've mentioned. This was an apolitical and independent-minded board of panellists who deemed Toby Young worthy of appointment.
Maria Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister really is seeking to defend the indefensible. As a former Minister for Disabled People, I am appalled at some of his recently expressed views about the place of disabled people in our society. Now, the Minister said that many of his tweets were from misogynistic tweets, though they may be many years ago. But his views about disabled people are very, very recent indeed. How can the Minister appoint somebody who thinks so little of the contribution of disabled people to our society to such an important position? It is indefensible, does he not agree?
Mr. Speaker, as I've already said, Mr. Young has been a champion of the inclusion of children with disabilities in mainstream education. And not only that, in his own work outside of his work with his schools, he is a patron of the residential care home in which his brother lives, and his brother has learning disabilities of his own.
Order, I'm looking to end these exchanges at 5:15, so people need to be very brief. Liz McInnes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says that he condemns Toby Young's past comments, but the only appropriate condemnation would be to remove him from the board of the Office for Students. And does he agree with me that a suitable replacement would be a representative from the University and Colleges Union so that university staff have a voice on the board?
Minister.
No, I don't think that would be appropriate. I think I take the same view that the Shadow Education Secretary took of the comments from, with respect to the comments by the member opposite for Sheffield Hallam, when she said that he deserved a second chance after the comments which he made, and that she was happy to sit alongside him because the comments happened a long time ago. In the Honourable Member, in the Honourable Shadow Secretary of State's words, people do change their views, it's important that they recognise that and apologise and correct their behaviour, and that's what we're expecting Toby Young to do.
If a Minister of the Crown were guilty of making these filthy and obnoxious remarks, would the Minister expect him to resign?
Going forward, the Nolan principles of public life will be applicable to Toby Young. He will be holding a public office as the board member of the Office for Students, and that's why it's been made very clear to him and to other board members of the Office for Students that if they make these kinds of objectionable comments and remarks, they will be in breach of those principles and would not be able to continue in their positions.
Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, what if the Minister could assist in this way? Does he think the good people of Broxtowe are more interested in the obnoxious tweets of somebody who made those tweets many years ago and nevertheless has an important position, or they'd actually be more interested in learning about the NHS crisis, which affected almost everybody in this country?
Minister.
I think my right honourable friend makes an important point. I think the party opposite's priorities are curious. We've had not a word from the leadership of the party opposite about what's going on in Iran, for example, focusing on their feigned outrage over Toby Young. They should really focus on the priorities facing this country, not these second-order ones.
Nick Dakin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister said earlier that in appointments to this board was a desire to represent the broad range of HE providers. So why did he find space for such a controversial appointment, but no space for somebody with FE experience when so many students are in further education?
Minister.
The board is representative of a broad range of higher education providers, as it's required to be by the terms of the Higher Education and Research Act. It contains a Vice-Chancellor of the University of the West of England. It contains a former Vice-Chancellor of BPP. It contains the Chair of Council of an Arts College, Rose Bruford College. It contains a senior figure from an Oxford college who happens to be the bursar, but also the Centre of Higher Education Policy Studies at Oxford. It's well representative of the diversity, the excellent diversity of our higher education system.
Well, Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I gently remind the Minister that abuse comes to all candidates, not just Conservative ones. I truly want to believe, Mr. Speaker, that this House takes the allegations of sexual harassment and inappropriate behaviour in the workplace seriously, but how can I when the Minister is continuing with the appointment of this misogynist man who thinks it's appropriate to constantly tweet about women's breasts, anal rape and masturbating over starving children?
Well, Mr. Minister, I don't see that we should take lessons from the party opposite on these matters. Take, for example, the case of the Shadow Chancellor, the member for Hayes and Harlington, who made some extraordinarily intemperate and misogynistic comments about my friend, the Right Honourable Member for Tatton. Too vile to repeat, Mr. Speaker, but they're typical of what the member for Birmingham Yardley described as the persistent, low-level, non-violent misogyny at the top of the Labour Party.
Better by not doing anything
Toby
about it.
Perkins.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister is really diminishing himself over the course of the last 45 minutes, and Toby Young really is not worth ruining his own career for. Can I say to the Minister that Mr. Young is someone who has contempt for women, has contempt for disabled people, has contempt for people from deprived communities who have the effrontery to try and get into Oxford? Will the Minister do the decent thing, disown Mr. Young and see his own reputation much enhanced for doing so?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're going over much the same ground as previous questions. The tweets and remarks and comments that Mr. Young have made were clearly wrong. He's absolutely right to have apologised for them. Since making many of these remarks, he's continued to do good work in our educational system. He's delivering good outcomes for disadvantaged pupils at his schools in West London. He's working hard on the Fulbright Commission. We have every expectation that he will make a valuable contribution to the work of the Office for Students.
Brennan.
Speaker, I think he said that that Mr. Young was deemed appointable by the panel without the knowledge of the information we've been hearing about of his past remarks. Were any other candidates deemed appointable by the panel but not appointed? And if that is the case, couldn't this be revisited with a view to appointing someone who doesn't have these kind of indecent views?
new question.
Mr. Speaker, as I've already said, the appointment process followed by the Office for Students Board panel was conducted in accordance with the Code of Practice published by the Office of the Commissioner for Public Appointments. Mr. Young was appointable. Many people were interviewed. This is an important body. And it was determined that he had characteristics that would enable him to acquit those responsibilities well.
Finally, Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, it's quite clear from the Minister's stumbling answers this afternoon that due diligence wasn't carried out on the appointment of this man. So the fact that he deleted 50,000 texts last week, does that not worry the Minister? Does it not worry the Minister that today he's told us about decades of abusive and offensive comments being made by this man? Surely this is the time to revisit the decision to appoint him.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Young's online oeuvre is not a great loss to the. It's not a great loss to the world. Personally speaking, I'm glad we don't have to go through it. It's probably a good thing that it's lost to the world. Mr. Young wants to move forward. He wants to focus on his important contributions that he's making to the outcomes of disadvantaged young people in West London and elsewhere in the country. And I think digging up past tweets and other comments dating back to the 1980s is really serving very little productive purpose.
Thank you. Order. Point of order, Mr. Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, on the 21st of December last year, during the debate on Russian interference in UK politics, I misspoke. I wrongly said that Nigel Farage had attended conferences in Russia. I've been informed that that is not true. How can I correct the record?
The honourable gentleman has found his own salvation, and we thank him for that. Nothing further needs to be said. Point of order, Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Speaker please clarify whether it's appropriate for a Minister to respond to an urgent question where his brother knows the individual appointee about whom the question is based personally? Is that in order and in line with our expectations within this Parliament?
Oh, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for her point of order. The answer to that is that it is for the government to decide who should respond to an urgent question. No impropriety has taken place. I'm not aware of the personal relationships. I'm not myself aware of the personal relationships to which the Honourable Lady refers. However, insofar as she's asking me, is there some breach of parliamentary protocol involved? The short answer is no. That may disappoint the Honourable Lady, but that's the factual answer. She's made her own point in her own way, and meanwhile I would like to thank all colleagues who've taken part in these exchanges and the Minister for his time and energies this afternoon. The issue has been given a very full airing today.